Happy
National Drive Electric Week.
Happy National Drive Electric Week.
Happy National Drive Electric Week.
Happy National Drive Electric Week from Evolve Houston.
Celebrate National Drive Electric Week with Evolve Houston by subscribing.
Welcome everyone, welcome in whoever is joining. We're about to start our webinar very soon. Happy National Drive Electric Week. Good afternoon everyone, and welcome to the UH Energy Electric Vehicle Webinar Series. Today we are joined by Professor Bruce Race, who will be talking about the pilot for equitable mobility. My name is Saad Maiman. I'm a MIS and finance student currently at the Bauer College of Business at the University of Houston, and I will be the moderator for today's event. Before we begin, I would like to take a minute to thank our sponsor, Evolve Houston. We're so glad that they're working with us to help provide Houstonians with reliable alternatives for transportation and accelerate clean through electrification. We have a lot more webinars. So if you would like, there should be a link in the chat where you guys can check out all of our previous webinars. Moving forward today, we will have a Q&A session at the end of this presentation. So you guys can hold on to your questions until the end. And after the presentation, I will be moderating the questions. And you guys can send those questions using the chat feature. And I will be moderating the questions in the order they receive, and we will try to answer as many questions as possible. Without further, I would like to introduce Professor Bruce Race, who is joined at the Gerald D. Hines School of Architecture as the Director of the University of Houston's Center for Sustainability and Resilience, where he seeks to understand the critical relationships between society, technological advances, and the corresponding impact on the environment, locally and globally. Dr. Race is PI for 2 energy and detention positive mixed-use projects in Houston, including the first mixed-use town center for Habitat for Humanity in the United States. Dr. Race is the principal and the founder of Race Studio and is responsible for all aspects of project planning, design, and delivery. Since founding Race Studio in Berkeley, California in 1994, his projects have received 33 designs and planning awards. He is one of the very few planning and designing professionals in the United States that have been elected to fellowship by the both American Institute of Architects and American Institute of Certified Planners. Dr. Race represents the college and the University of Houston's Deans of Research Committee, is the UH Energy Fellow, and a 2018 50 and 5 Scholar. So I would like to introduce Professor Bruce Race, and you can take over.
All right, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. So that's the first time I've seen your kickoff EV week with Evolve Houston. That was very fun. And so, we're right on the edge of a transition, and it's going to change our economy. It's going to change how we move, and it's going to impact our lifestyle. And so, as a researcher, I've been keenly interested in both how that can improve our environment and our economy. And I've had an opportunity to work with Metro on developing a proposal, the National Science Foundation, that starts to look at a smart transit hub, but also the major focus on equity and how we start to look at electric mobility in the future, how we can start to make sure that everyone benefits from the economic and the environmental benefits from that. Well, it's an interdisciplinary team. I'm an architect and urban planner, and this is what we do. We always assemble an interdisciplinary team. So we have computer science, we have Aaron Driss who's from computer engineering technology, Vikram, who's an economist, and many of you know Ramanand, so Ramanand's from UH Energy. And one of our important partners is Kim Williams, who's the chief innovation officer for Metro. And so this is what it takes to really see a problem in the round. You really need this kind of expertise to come together. Metro already has a research platform. They are innovators. They are looking for ways to reduce emissions and improve service, and are keenly interested in this because the outcome they're looking for from this effort is a template, a digital architecture they can use on all their park and ride sites. So this is one park and ride site in 30, which is the pilot that we're looking at. We have some overall objectives. So we want to think about how we deploy these smart technologies. There's always this big data issue, and how we start to look at how we understand that data. And our computer scientists will be looking at how to look at machine learning and AI and really think about how to be able to put together a simulation of how modes work together now and in the future. So, and in this process, we want to think about how we're going to stimulate access to Metro and the Metro system, but also how the kind of partnerships that can benefit from an interactive approach in this. Ultimately, the grid is also going to have to take on more of a load because that's where our offsets are. We, by 2050, will reduce our emissions by 70%, but the last 30% of emissions is going to be based on providing renewable energy. So we have to understand how the grid is going to perform for that. So many cities have intelligent, smart transportation systems, and sometimes it's intelligent transit systems, or ITS. You hear that. There's a lot more applications in the coastal areas in the United States, and many of these zones, because of their educational attainment and their income, are really early adopters regionally. You see states and regions and cities endeavoring to pull together the kind of technologies and interface for that supports the next generation of transportation. However, not many are really looking at how to do this from an equitable perspective. And that's something that we thought was really important to include. So you think about equitable access. And so in an intelligent mobility system, you have to anticipate your electric vehicles and autonomous vehicle technologies. You see in the top circle in this diagram, we're always looking at this intermodal performance. I've worked on several intermodal stations, big ones, master planning them. So always just really understanding that end-to-end experience in a trip and how these various modes of transportation layer and connect. And ultimately, that's the context where we have to look at equity and mobility. So you can see in between, for example, intermodal performance, you think about the physical access or the system service, the affordability for that. So all these have some interaction in terms of how it impacts who has access to the system and what the benefits are. Well, our pilot site is in Southwest Houston. So this is the West Belfort station, and it's one of 30 park and ride sites that Metro has. So this is really an excellent site to really start exploring a template, a digital architectural template for these kinds of projects. And also, from a social science perspective, has some other very interesting things to explore. So on the right here is a diagram from a few years ago about the ridership from the West Belfort Park and Rides. This is from a license plate survey. And so basically about 7 out of 10 riders are coming from outside the Metro service area. They're from Fort Bend County. Fort Bend County, high educational attainment, high income, perfect, test bed for looking at early adoption for EV, for electric vehicles. And on the other side, we'll talk more about it, it's a very different kind of neighborhood. So Metro is also in the process of planning and building a new parking structure on the site. There's about 3,000 boardings that happen there a day, and the primary destinations being the Med Center and downtown. So we have this split market. So you have this regional opportunity in Fort Bend County, but we have a local market which is quite different and has a very different work pattern. We'll say more about that in a moment. So you have this broad vision for these types of smart transit hubs. So you want to think about that. There's a technology piece of it. You have to look forward. There may be this autonomous and EV shuttle systems. Smart parking and charging. This is something, because it is a park and ride. So this is one of the things that we're going to be focusing on. And it's everything from the operations, types of permits, incentives you bake into it, and really looking forward to the kind of travel experience then that reflects all these innovations. There's also an implementation side. So quite often our political realities, end up in the implementation side. So how you market this, where's the leadership come from on this, and what's the cost planning and sharing for that, both in terms of the resources that go into it and the benefits that come out of it. Well, it is an intermodal station, and it doesn't have all the modes there now that we'll have in the future, but you do have to plan for that. So it starts with the rider. So you have to think about where people are coming from and these on-site and last mile connections for those who live around the site. And so you have to think about the split of modes and whether they're going local and regional, and also the kinds of modes that may be on the site in the future. So this matrix, the animation is turned off in the system, so it's covering up what I'd like to talk about. But you think about the park and ride user that comes to the site. Across the top, they have all these different modes they need to work, have connections to. But this happens in really a whole matrix of other kinds of connections that need to happen on the site. So that is both a physical planning and design problem, but also a scheduling and operational challenge as well. So we have these larger issues and opportunities. So we have to think about the grid impact. So we have to think about the EV charging impacts on that. We have to balance, how we optimize access to public charging, fast charging, and can that be equitable? And of course, it's a park and ride, so we have to think about how we integrate the park and ride with EV charging. We have to think about how we engage the community. We are exploring the kind of barriers to adoption for electric mobility and electric vehicles. That's a very important part of one of the things that we're looking at. We all were online today because of the pandemic. And so this is another one of these realities, particularly for public transit nationally. People are starting to rethink about how we use transit now in the future. And like any smart technology, we have to figure out how we use data, how we analyze it, and how we provide privacy for that. And ultimately, we have to think about how we collect that and how it informs our decisions in real time. So if you're on your way to the park and ride, you want to know you have a spot ready for you. And so that's really part of this overall seamless travel experience. So you want to be able to arrive, know where your parking spot is, charge, have that sync with your Metro Pass, and possibly even have license plate readers and these other kinds of technologies. So it's all touchless. You just park and go. And so, in an overall smart system for that, we have to be able to monitor the number of available spaces. You have to tell the drivers where they are. The parking operator has to be able to pay attention to that. And so this also has to sync with the other schedules and travel information. So ultimately, this all is part of one system. Metro isn't built like that at the moment, so there's even these institutional business models that may have to be tested to parallel with this. It seems simple to say, but this diagram is from Department of Transportation. It's a best management practices digital architecture diagram just for smart parking. And this is just one piece, if you think about a big intermodal station, of the kind of interactions and how data flow and information flows in these types of systems. So to be able to master plan something like this and simulate it, that's part of the challenge we have and for this assignment. There's some critical questions that need to be addressed. And partly it's understanding the community and what their needs are. Actually, on the left side of the slide is a study that my center did with the super neighborhoods in the mid-Braes Bayou, and this was actually Braes Oaks, where the West Belfort station is located. We looked at all the housing that was impacted by Hurricane Harvey and looked at what the needs were for that. And so this is just the demographics just for that one super neighborhood around the station. So we understand this, some broader access issues, understand what the barriers are to EV ownership, or maybe it's not ownership, maybe it's just access to being able to do rideshare or underwritten rentals. And ultimately too, there's going to be opportunity for emission reductions. This means that it can improve our air quality and reduce our climate impacts. From a social science perspective, one of the challenges we have in Greater Houston is we are a poster child for how our low-wage employment is spread all over the region. So on this map, the orange is the metro service corridors. The dark blue are African-American neighborhoods, and the yellow circles are the locations for low-wage employment. And you will notice there's not a lot of transit access or services to these low-wage employment centers. So what do you do as a family? And also as you start to think about how the other implications for that as well. So this map shows the bigger the orange square on the map, the more unemployment that's located there. And so within a 2-mile radius, this is the flip side of what we're seeing in Fort Bend County, is that as compared to the region, that these families have lower educational attainment, there's a higher percentage of low-wage earners, higher percentage of poverty, we have a much higher percentage of renters. That's important if you think about 80% of our charging happens at home. They have long commutes, as we saw in the previous slide, and they're less likely, 17% less likely to take mass transit. But these are households that could definitely benefit from having improved transit service. Well, there's barriers to EV ownership, and these are the things that we want to explore solutions for. So there's a loss to families and opportunity costs. Many, if you're not in the new car market, you don't understand the tax credits. You're not even going to the dealer where somebody can even try to sell you a car. Often there's a credit. You have a challenge getting credit for a new car. You may not work somewhere where you have employee benefits that are incentives for eco-commuters. For example, UH just had its first batch of EV charging on campus put in. So we can be eco-commuters on the UH campus. And also, maybe not be aware of local incentives. And many of our working families also are Uber drivers or Lyft drivers. And the city of Houston, for example, is looking at a partnership for electric vehicles because Uber's made a commitment that 40% of their drivers will be driving EV by 2030. Also, the obvious thing is initial purchase costs. And so it costs more initially to buy an electric vehicle. And so these are families that really can benefit from having a 40% lower maintenance cost. And actually you start to look at different kinds of comparisons. So even if you were to buy an entry-level Camry, that a Tesla 3 is going to save you over $600 a year. And so these are the kind of families that can benefit from that. I live in the East End, and a lot of my hardworking neighbors drive old SUVs and old trucks. And if they're trying to keep one of those on the road, and you compare that to an entry-level Tesla, they're going to, over the 15 years life of the Tesla, they're going to spend $20,000 more So how do you resolve that? There's no secondhand car market yet, so you have to look at how to stimulate access to vehicles. One of the other aspects of this, one of the indicators really, is how you provide public charging. And so if you live in a community that doesn't have it, that's a cost of convenience. And so, and part of this is that very few apartment complexes have chargers. And particularly if you live in some of these low-income apartment complexes in the Southwest, they don't have chargers, are not likely to have chargers. So how do you provide community access to charging? And even if you do own a home, there's still a cost involved with it. And $2,500 or $2,600 is a lot if you have a household income of under $50,000. One of the potential strategies, is to leverage the early adopters that live in Fort Bend County and find a way to have them help support putting in public charging at a park and ride site that can create access for people who live nearby. Or another strategy that the Biden administration is looking at, charge corridors. And because we're located at Highway Loop 8 and I-69, that we're at an intersection, so that's another layer of funding and incentive opportunities for locations like this. So there's some indicators for early adoption. So if you have high educational and income, and strangely enough, not just one or the other, both. If you own your home, you have multiple cars in the household, you may have already be doing car sharing programs, that you have access to public charging, and then also your values, your political party affiliation, for example. When you start to look at the other types of indicators for equity, these are the things that we're going to sharpen as part of this effort. But then you start to look at SVIs, the social vulnerability in these communities, but also what's regionally the affordability and diversity of our EV fleet. And then how are we motivating just in terms of new business models to provide access? And then just general awareness. Are our families even aware of the kind of incentives or benefits that they can gain from this? Now, in an environmental justice perspective, there's also the air quality piece of this, and that is often seen as a co-benefit when we start looking at climate action. So a couple summers ago, we worked with students who put together a pollution atlas for Houston. So in this map, we actually modeled over 270 segments of highway for their PM 2.5 emissions annually. So the wider the red line on the map, the more PM 2.5 are impacting these communities. The blue dots are warehouse and distribution centers. So you start to see that pattern. So you think of where the diesel exhaust is from truck traffic, that our inland port impacts. So you can obviously see on the map the kind of activities happening around the Port of Houston. We analyzed 50 sensors, air quality sensors in the region, and also mapped all the point sources for PM 2.5. And this is on top of the environmental justice map, on top of that SVI map. So you can start to see that the darker blue neighborhoods are the ones that are most vulnerable. And also we mapped on here our complete communities, Houston complete communities as well. So we are in a location where communities are already impacted by transportation PM 2.5 emissions, and that can be a co-benefit. Our climate action plan in Houston, I co-chaired the transportation working group and did the modeling for the different policy scenarios. So our transportation emissions are about half of our emissions. It's 48% of our emissions, and almost all that for the city of Houston is on-road emissions. So 99% of it. So we think about railroads or aviation, some of these other modes, but really it's what's on the roads is making the biggest contribution to our greenhouse gas emissions. And for all of us, the reason why the EV fleet is so important is that that 9/10 of it, 89% of our on-road emissions actually is in our driveways. So those are the kinds of our small trucks and cars and RVs and everything, all that other stuff, that's on us. And then the next area is our delivery trucks in Houston. And so that's why an EV fleet is so imperative for us to hit our targets, for our 2050 targets for being a net zero community. You think about this over time, and so that you can see here a decade by decade target for our reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And the same, and that's on the demand side on the top. On the bottom are these supply side goals. So the same, in parallel for that, we have to think about how we're providing renewable energy at the same time to offset electrification of the fleet. And there's an achievement gap. And so you start to look at, this was comparing the different policy scenarios for transportation. So, but it has a footprint. It has a geographic footprint. And so to offset just for the city of Houston, by 2050, we'll need, with today's technology, 8 square miles of West Texas or some sort of distributed PV system. We're very dependent on wind as renewable as well. So we have to find some mixed approach for renewable energy to offset what we're driving to make net zero happen. So you got to look forward at the same time. So here's 3 scenarios. I wanted to start to think about what sort of air quality and climate benefits it might come from just looking at the commuters that come to one park and ride station. But so I looked at 3 scenarios. There's a status quo, sort of a baseline. Another one, a sprawl model. What happens if we continue to grow in Fort Bend County, but this area southwest Houston stagnates and doesn't grow? Just is industry and tilt up and warehousing, and it doesn't grow population. And a third scenario, more of a smart growth scenario, that says, what happens if you start to look at this at more infill development and we're growing around a transit hub like this? And so this looks at it a bit differently. So when you start to look at these scenarios, so the first scenario reflects that 70-30 regional local split in terms of ridership. It assumes that this is a group of people already using transit, so there's about a 20% reduction in vehicle miles traveled per capita. It just goes with today's boardings, and it assumes, you see on the lower left here, that we're driving the equivalent of an F-150. That's your 24 mile per gallon fleet. That's what it is in Houston right now. The second scenario looks at most of the growth happening on the edge of the region. And with a 30% reduction in VMT, because we're getting smart about that, 5,000 instead of 3,000 bus boardings, and we're all driving the equivalent of a Prius. So this really reflects the Obama era CAFE standards for cars and small trucks. Scenario 3 is really forward-looking and assumes many of the things that we're looking at in terms of the Houston Climate Action Plan. So you're looking at a very different kind of split. So 40% of the trips actually are local. You're looking at a 40% reduction in VMT because there is more local access and first and last mile solutions. We really see an increase in bus boardings, and we're all driving a Ford Mach-E. Or I'd rather say that than a Nissan Leaf. It just seems, sexier. And so, but this is what happens. You can see under these different growth scenarios just the kind of mileage. This is the daily commute miles, from these 3 scenarios. And so even though you have 7,000 boardings, compared to 5,000 boardings, that you can see that you're getting a comparative reduction in daily mileage that's driven. This looks at annual CO2e, so our greenhouse gas emissions, and PM 2.5. And so this is a comparison between these 3 scenarios. And so one of the things you see in this is that if you're growing the suburbs and you're not electrifying the fleet, that will significantly increase our greenhouse gas emissions in PM 2.5. And that is not the business as usual, which would be worse in scenario 2, but that's a more modest approach looking at how we look at growth and modes and electrification. And finally, if you just think about what it means for each of us per capita, and so in terms of our climate and our greenhouse gas emissions impact, that you can just see that if you travel local and you live in a walk first community and you're driving an EV, that it's much easier to get to zero than if you're not. So for example, if you go back and look at our annual emissions, that if you add about 0.7 acres of PV, you could do this on site or it could be scattered. Just that amount of PV would zero out the commuter miles or commuter emissions that are left after we reduce it 70% the baseline. So those are some of the benefits. But really, equity is not just about being able to afford an electric vehicle. We have to stand back and look at this in context. So we want to improve transit service. So we want it smarter, more comfortable, safer, reliable, and think about a completely end-to-end experience. So in terms of how we look at it, we have to think about this as an inclusive effort and opportunity. We want this to be a shared experience for all of us. We have to look at how we break barriers to EV ownership and sharing. We have to think even maybe about new business models to provide access. We have to see who the early adopters are regionally. We want to be able to leverage that so they can help underwrite the electric vehicle charging infrastructure. And then we can't forget all these co-benefits. We know in Houston what the climate impacts are. My students talk about seeing the climate change in real time. I've yet to have a semester since I've come to Houston in 2015 that hasn't been interrupted by a climate event. In fact, last year, Climate Week for the city of Houston was interrupted by the climate. So this is part of our reality. And so another important co-benefit, particularly for us in Houston, is improved air quality. And we can't forget the economic upside of this. So we're looking at new green tech, energy, sales, and support kinds of jobs that are possible if we think about it from a community development perspective. So that concludes my presentation, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. So I'm not hearing anybody from the moderation side of this, but I'd be happy to,
Yes.
to go through the.
Thank you, Professor, for your presentation.
You're welcome.
I would like to open the chat feature for you guys to send in your questions so we can start our live Q&A. We already have a couple. I'll start with from Raya. Why aren't more EV chargers being built, and where are EV chargers currently made?
They are made everywhere. I am not the technology expert, but but it is not a bad question because it's the economics part of it. And just the same way we're looking at our vehicle supply chain right now, it gets caught up in some of that. What's more important is where the demand is. And I think that's really important. And that's part of the challenge. And I was thinking about who's adopting EV technologies and how we start to match that demand with where we put public charging, for example. 80% of our charging happens at home. So there's a wide array of the kinds of charging you can do. In fact, you can just plug it into a 110 outlet at home. It's called trickle charging. It takes a long time to charge your car, but you can work without one. But most folks opt for what's called a level 2 charger in their garage.
Okay, thank you. Next one is, what do you think about the recycling aspect of spent lithium and ion batteries?
Well, what's the bumper-to-bumper environmental impacts from vehicles, right? So a lot of manufacturers have tried to get out in front of that. So they've been looking at the at recycled materials. Batteries are now finding an afterlife, and they're used and they're recycled and repackaged for grid backup or microgrid backup. So there's a lot of aspects of that, and we know that the battery discussion is evolving, right? And so there's new technologies being explored in terms of battery technologies, and by 2050 we'll be probably 2 generations in on different kinds of batteries.
Okay. Next one is from Mike. Is a V2G vehicle to grid on the roadmap for possible use as an offset?
Say that again.
Is vehicle to grid on the roadmap possible use as an offset? I think the question should have popped up on your screen as well.
So I'm assuming you're talking about more embedded technologies in the infrastructure for that. So there's 3. I think you look forward. There's 3 ways to look at investment. So the first level is from an operations and applications perspective, and the second level is nodal. We start to look at the smart transit hubs and how we embed infrastructure and that, and even charging infrastructure. In the longer term, we'll have a much broader set of benefits. You look at more embedded technology, so hot road beds and these other types of charging systems. Actually talked with another person interested in the truck transportation, and we modeled what it would take to electrify the truck fleet between Houston and Dallas. And it requires a lot of PV. When he estimated the energy, I looked at it and went, we have to find a lot of vacant land between here and Dallas if we want to do something, because the freeway right away wasn't big enough, because it was just much more demanding. And so it is an interesting problem, and I'm sure the folks who are doing smart infrastructure and embedded technologies are going to change the world.
All right, thank you so much for that. Next question that we have is, what is the extent of industry engagement by UH to participate in a public-private ecosystem to enhance EV adoption in Houston? And how do private companies work with UH to build such an ecosystem?
Sure. We are a very important partner in the Evolve Houston effort. And so that's one of the venues that is looking at EV technology and adoption. And in our process, we want to think about, we actually have 2 groups we're working with. There'll be a larger stakeholders group calling the steering committee, which is more reflective of the ridership state and stakeholders for Metro. We also have a technology working group, and that includes people from industry, from EV charging, energy, and communication technologies. And so there are researchers, people from industry, and folks from Metro. So we're looking at the factors for success for Intelligent Transit Hub. So we're really creating an opportunity for that kind of interaction, to look at all the layers for that. So when we do a digital master plan or digital template for the site, we have everybody's input, and then we define what success looks like. That is a model that's very exportable, because that is not what we're doing in larger Houston, right? So it's a very interesting engagement model that can be scaled up.
Thank you. Next one is, how does Houston rate on percentage of EV adoption compared to other major cities around the United States for both transit authorities and personal vehicles?
Well, for personal vehicles, we're quite low, and so, but we're accelerating. So one of the metrics, is the market response for public chargers. So average metros have about 450 chargers per million people. We were way below that. San Jose's has and we're expanding about 30% a year. And you look at somewhere like San Jose has got probably 7 times more public chargers, and they're expanding at 40% a year. So they're growing almost exponentially compared to us. So we have an opportunity in our market to be more than we are for that. And so one of the other challenges now is a chip shortage, right? And so it's just hard getting any kind of vehicle. That's one of the other, so the timing piece of it, I'm very impatient. So we need more sooner.
Okay. And next one is from Johan. It says, what else can city leaders do to encourage private sector interest and collaboration to drive greater equity in deploying charging infrastructure to underserved communities?
Sure. I think the project that we're working with Houston Habitat for Humanity, like we're interested in perhaps doing providing fast charging at the library that's going to be on the site, right? And so that's a community that could really benefit from that. And the fast charging now is almost like a retail function at some level. So Starbucks is going to have chargers because the time you can drink a latte, you're filled up, right? And so it's a what a gas station looks like will be very different. For those who saw my presentation a couple of years ago talking about this, both my grandfathers owned gas stations, and I built mufflers. I built exhaust systems in a factory. That obviously is all different. So what does the gas station look like? It'll be very different than we have now, right? I'm more interested also in the pricing and incentives and some other things about the vehicle, getting access to vehicles, shared vehicles, and how they're charged. You're muted. Side, you're muted. Thank you. I said, okay.
To those who are interested in electrifying their fleets?
Well, there are the public fleets are probably less than 1% of our emissions in Houston. And so there's, the public and institutional fleet vehicles. They are very important test beds, and there's a lead by example, sometimes it's called LBE, which is very important for that. Corporate fleets, depending on the kind of vehicles and the kind of tax incentives that exist. So the EPA website has a matrix by vehicle type and incentives up to about $7,500 per vehicle.
Okay. Another one is, Kyle mentioned that I know NSF values innovation when awarding grants. Can you speak a little bit about what makes this program innovative?
Based on the feedback we got from NSF for this grant, that they're interested in two things came up as a discussion based on our initial proposal that they focused on. One was about equitable access to EV. That just same with our literature review, we started to look at this topic nationally. There wasn't a lot of literature about this. There hadn't been a lot of research in this area. So that's a gap in research. That's something that they're interested in. And the other, which played into my sweet spot, is they were quite interested in how we might assess the type of environmental benefits from a program like this. Now, the rest of it, from an innovation perspective, there is the engagement process itself in terms of how, because NSF, like many of our federal agencies, are much more interested now in interdisciplinary research. That's where the kind of innovations come from, that kind of interaction and problem solving. And they also want to see community partners. So the fact that Metro is a full-on community partner running the community outreach piece, and that Kim Williams is actually one of our principal investigators. We went through the paperwork with her to get her to be an official PI in the NSF process. So she's on the team. So that's another dimension to this. I think besides that, the way we're looking at simulations and how we start to simulate this, and then we're looking at the technology integration, are two other areas that interested them. And from my perspective, is that we're really looking at it as an integrative solution and as a pilot. So we're integrating all these kinds of technologies and science with the community, and with a goal of having real outcomes, real impacts.
Thank you so much for that. We have another question similar to a previous one. It is, how do you stimulate interest in e-mobility in historically undeserved communities like complete communities? And how do you incorporate community input to best implement e-mobility solutions?
Right. You start with what kind of transportation needs a community has, right? So you saw early on, even before we got the grant, the kind of the social demographic analysis that I was doing, and looking at where people work, their occupations, where they had to commute, and I was surprised to find that they were less likely to use, even though they're close to a park and ride site, because the bus didn't go to this dispersed pattern of low income or low wage employment. That's an ongoing challenge in working neighborhoods. Back to the 60s, it's been a huge challenge of this disconnect between work and transportation between work and home. And so you really have to look at the needs of each of those communities. There's things that we can do, which because part of the Complete Communities program is really playing catch up on infrastructure and institutional services that these communities deserve and have lacked for generations. And so building into that, Metro's already running an electric bus pilot in these neighborhoods, so that's part of the environmental benefit. You're cutting back in PM 2.5 that you get from a diesel bus. So those have become priority routes. So how we look at new kinds of electric transportation, everything from electric bikes and scooters, we're starting to see some of that around town. Now these are sort of easy first and last mile solutions, and they're flexible, they create new kinds of jobs, and they're quite affordable. And so there's going to be a lot more innovation coming just about the modes, the kind of modes that are available that do when we start to electrify, these other kinds of personal transport that we used to call active commute modes, which would be biking.
I think Evolve Houston is working with a similar plan to kind of promote e-mobility in the undeserved communities. So that's great to hear. Could you please mention the name of the PI working with the NSF on EV adoption? Someone just asked for that. I think you just mentioned NSF? The name of the PI working with the NSF on EV adoptions. I think someone just. Okay.
Oh no, that's at Metro, not at. Yeah, so yeah, that's. Kim Williams she's the Chief Innovation Officer at Metro. But at NSF, there's their Smart and Connected Communities programs have different, program managers and all that. And so if somebody's interested in that, they should look at the program, and the program managers on the NSF website.
And
And they're quite approachable.
Curtis asked, what are your thoughts on EV life management as community-based economic opportunity?
Life, L-I-F-E management?
Life cycle management.
Life cycle. Yeah, that's a completely different concept. Don't look to me for life management, everybody. but life cycle, there's a lot of business opportunity in that, because you really start to look at when you start to look at products now, the whole thing about, we used to think about planned obsolescence of vehicles, and now and it was like a cradle to grave concept. Now it's cradle to cradle. You have to think about the interoperability aspects, how we switch out parts. These are going to be longer life vehicles, require less maintenance. Are we developing vehicles that are going to be able to accept new battery technologies or charging technologies? So it's sort of plug and play, and a lot of the manufacturers are already there. They're already looking at these types of aspects as a platform. And from an economic perspective, there's going to be a shift in energy, the kind of energy jobs we have in the region. This is another whole webinar on the economic impacts for this. But there's going to be a lot of opportunities at the local level as well. And so, in the little conference we had on campus a couple of years ago, I talked about what my grandpa's service station would look like, and it was a coffee shop. He was a businessman. He also owned a candy store and a liquor store. He saw the business opportunity, and so these kinds of how we work these new technologies into local business opportunities, either through direct service jobs and sales or through franchise opportunities. There's a business innovation opportunity there that last time I checked, this is still the United States, and we abhor a vacuum. We will create all these jobs and all these new innovative models for supporting our fleet transition.
I believe we have time for one last question. What are the prospects for secondhand market for EVs?
Well, in the regions that already have that, so if you, for example, get your hands on a used Chevy Bolt, that doesn't have a big driving range, but if you are, but if you need something for around Houston and everyday commuting, they're quite affordable now to get, and over time, that kind of secondhand car market is going to grow. And particularly if you're a local commuter, you don't need a 500-mile range or 350-mile range. That these cars that have 123 or 150-mile range are plenty for what we need to get around Houston. I think also you're going to see the kind of innovation in the car designs and all that are going to also start to reflect some of our market segments differently than we have historically too.
I think we are coming close to time, so this was the last question. I just would like to say thank you, Professor Bruce, Professor, for taking your time out to join us for this month's webinar. Before I end, I would like to thank Evolve again. They've been working really hard to put content out this week for National Electric Week, so make sure to check out their channel. They are putting out new video every day for this week. So yes, I would like to thank them. Lastly, keep an eye out for next month's webinar. We will be sending out details for it very soon. And so thank you again for joining. Without you guys, these webinars wouldn't be possible. Thank you again, Professor Race. and have a wonderful rest of your week.